Sometime about 20 years ago, a teenage me spent most of his time flicking through White Dwarf magazines, dreaming that one day he'd be able to paint like the heavy metal painters. Well, today, I'm going to attempt it. So about 20 years ago, I painted this guy. Now, as you can see, he's not exactly heavy metal standard. This was, in fact, one of the first miniatures that I ever painted when I first got into miniature wargaming in my early teens. Now, it didn't take long after getting into Warhammer 40,000 for me to realise the awesomeness of elves, and particularly of the elves in Blood Bowl. Now, this point of my hobby collecting career was really White Dwarf's heyday. I spent a lot of my time flicking through the pictures of various, now very retro, White Dwarfs, and just looking at those paint jobs, dreaming that one day I would be able to paint like the heavy metal team. Now, as a lad in my early teens, I was really in awe of the paint jobs produced by the heavy metal team. The lovely, bright, colourful, very highly saturated paint jobs that they did, the beautiful, crisp highlighting, and yeah, I just looked at it and thought, wow, I really, really want to be able to do this. And needless to say, as you can tell from seeing this model, I definitely couldn't. So now, 20 years later, I would say my skills have definitely improved considerably from back in that day. I've learned new techniques, and I will say my brush control is definitely much better than it was. So today I'm going to take a stab at painting this guy up, not only in the same style as the heavy metal painters, but I'm going to shoot for the same quality as well. Before I start the painting though, let's have a look at the old heavy metal style that we're going to be shooting for. Here is the heavy metal version of the Prince Moranion model, and as you can see, he shows a few of the real trademarks of this era of painting. Very saturated and vibrant colour choices, huge amount of contrast between the highlights and the shadows, and that really ugly goblin green base. Now, to replicate this will involve using some of the more basic techniques. I'll be using layering to achieve the highlights, so no creamy wet blending here. I'm also going to have to fight the urge to use washes, something that unfortunately in my style of painting I am going to find very, very difficult. Before I start getting any paint on him though, I'm going to need to strip these layers off. Obviously, at this point in my hobby career, I didn't know anything about properly thinning my paint. To remove the paint, I'm going to use some brown Dettol. Using a plastic cup, I'll pour some in and drop him in. I'll leave him in here for a few hours to marinate a little bit, and for all those layers upon layers of paint to soften up. Now, once he's been in there a while, out he comes again, and then with dirt cheap toothbrush, I'll pretty aggressively attack that paint job. As it's a pewter mini, we can be fairly brutal here, as things shouldn't break off or damage too much. And to be honest, with the amount of layers I've put on this guy, it's not only going to take some elbow grease, but probably a few attempts too. So fast forward a bit now, and I've managed to remove almost all of that paint. So now it's time to prep him for his nice shiny new paint job. With some green stuff, I'll plug in those unsightly holes left in the slotter base. And then with some Astro Granite, I'll give some texture to the top of that base. And now, he's actually ready for some paint. A nice layer of Vallejo surface primer will start us off. But as you can see, I've used a black primer, even though high elves are supposed to be all bright and shiny. Now, I'm sure a load of you are out there saying, what the hell are you doing? You don't use a black undercoat when painting white. Well, when using inks, you definitely do. Grabbing the airbrush back out again, I'm going to start applying some Liquitex White Ink. To really make the most out of the inks, you need to apply it by gently building up the layers rather than just pulling the trigger back and going for it. Whilst I'll hit almost every area of the model, the majority is going to be built up from above the model. This is called zenithal highlighting, and is great for showing me where all those shadows would be cast if the light source was directly overhead. Now, inks aren't the strongest wearing, and I especially do not trust them on a pewter model, so to seal them in, I'm going to give a nice coat of matte varnish, again through the airbrush. So as you can see, that zenithal has given some lovely highlights, and I can now see all those shadowed areas. I'm pretty happy leaving this as it is for all of the white areas. So instead, I'm going to tackle the predominant colour on this model, the nice dark green. Using Vallejo's dark green, I'll give all of those green areas a few very thin coats. This paint definitely isn't the best for coverage, so I'm going to take my time and build this up rather than just slapping it on. You can already see that this paint is naturally drawing down into the recesses of the model, so it's already doing part of the job of highlighting for me, but I just need to make sure that that coverage is there and that it's not leaving any little patchy areas. Now, rather than going straight in with the highlights, I'm going to block in the base colours for the real eye-catching part of this model, and that's the orangey red colours on his helm. For the base coat for these areas, I've used a couple of layers of Citadel's Corn Red. Now our base colours are in, and it's time to get highlighting. As mentioned, I'm going to be going for the look of the 90s heavy metal painters, so this means no washes for the shadows, and I'm going to have to layer in all those shadows and highlights. Starting with a mix of dark green and warpstone glow, I'll start layering down some thin layers where I want all those highlights to sit. With each successive layer being slightly smaller than the last, I'll then proceed to work this up through pure warpstone glow and then mixing in some Vallejo Escorpina green until I hit that real bright, almost pure Escorpina green highlight tone right on the tips of those green areas. This gives that really stark contrast that the Games Workshop Eavy Metal Studio in the 90s was very much famous for. So having done that, it's time to do exactly the same for those orangey red colours on the helm. Firstly, with a couple of layers of Mephiston Red, and then I will progressively mix in some Fire Dragon Bright to build up those layers in exactly the same way up until a very small dot of pure Fire Dragon Bright right on the end. So for that dragon head on his helm, Games Workshop have painted it in a really faint green. Now if I was doing it with current techniques, I'd probably just slap on a bit of Tesseract Glow and have done with it. But since we're doing this retro, it's going to start off with Escorpina green again. And again, I'm going to achieve the effect by layering those highlights in. Adding ever increasing amounts of white to the mix, I'll start to build up this almost ghostly looking green. Who needs Tesseract Glow? Now it's time to tackle those skin tones, and in the old Games Workshop painting style, there were again some pretty stark and slightly ugly deep recess colours. So to achieve this, I'm actually going to start with a base coat of Rhinox hide. This will give me that real dark brown that gives all that insane amount of contrast that they're famous for. Sadly, I no longer have any of my favourite skin tone paint from the 90s left, so in the absence of a bottle of bronzed flesh, Cadian Flesh Tone will have to suffice. Now the detail in some of these old sculpts isn't amazingly well defined like the new CAD design minis, so with a hopefully steady hand, I'll pick out all of those raised areas, adding a little bit of Rakarth Flesh into the Cadian Flesh Tone will then give me the final highlight of all those skin tones. Whilst the Rakarth Flesh is handy, I'll also use it just to pop a little bit of paint on those dragon's horns on his helm. So now we're getting pretty close to finished. For the football he's carrying, I definitely wanted the feel of the old American footballs. So starting off with Steel Legion Drab to give it that nice faded brown tone, and then a little bit of Xandri Dust to highlight the detail on it and just to make it look a little bit worn. Gives a nice, pretty simple but effective look. For that bling around his neck, I'll start off by painting it a Baden Black, just to give those nice dark shadows. And then with some good old trusty lead belcher, I'll pick out the chain and the medallion. He's also got a couple of gems on his armour, and being a high elf, they obviously need to be pretty shiny. Sticking with the same colour palette, I'll use some Vallejo Dark Green as a base. Then with some Warpstone Glow, I'll paint across the bottom 2/3 of the gem in a diagonal line to give the mid-tone. Adding a little dab of Escorpina Green in the real bottom right, and then a little touch of white into that dark green will give the impression of that gem reflecting and refracting the light. For his base, I wasn't happy going with the real traditional 90s look, and I wanted him to really look like he's in mid-game. So first I needed to lay down some dirt, starting with Rhinox Hide as the base, and then with successive dry brushes with Steel Legion Drab and then Steel Legion Drab with a tiny bit of white added, I'll achieve this effect. I'm going to cover most of it in static grass though, so with a bit of Mod Podge I'll cover most of the base, just leaving a few gaps here and there to let the dirt show through. Grabbing my static grass, I'll then sprinkle it all over the base. Sadly, I don't own a static grass applicator to make this easier. Once that glue's all dry, I'm going to add a nice white line to really make it look like a football pitch. With a couple of strips of masking tape cut out, I'll lay them down to form a mask, and then with a small piece of sponge I'll dab some white paint onto the grass. This will give a nice uneven white line, like you would get on a tatty old pitch like this one. And as for a final touch for the base, it really wouldn't be Blood Bowl without a bit of blood. So using another bit of sponge, I'll dab some blood for the blood god onto the grass and over the white line, just to finish it off and give that nice effect. And then we're done. Going from this to this. So what do you think, guys? Did I achieve my aim of being able to paint like the Eavy Metal Studio? Looking at models like this really makes me appreciate what has changed and what has improved over the last 20 years. Not just in the models, in the sculpting, the production, the materials are used, but also in the standard of painting. I look at the 90s Eavy Metal Studio, and whilst it's got its charm, to compare it to the top painters, your Darren Lathams, your Richard Greys nowadays, is almost night and day. And whilst I feel that in the 20 years my painting and my skills have improved dramatically, and clearly looking at this model that kind of shows it, but now I still look at the current heavy metal painters, again mentioning Darren Latham, and I look at what they produce in absolute awe. But to do an exercise like this, comparing myself to my previous self, really gives me a bit more of an appreciation of how my skills have improved. Hell, maybe if YouTube exists in another 20 years, I'll take a stab at painting a model like Darren Latham. If you've enjoyed this video, then please let me know by hitting that like button down below, and let me know in the comments if you think that I've achieved my aim. If you want further content like this, then please hit that big red subscribe button. And remember guys, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.